What my son's future father-in-law didn't know, when he stood in my backyard at my granddaughter's birthday party and told me I was punching above my weight class, just by being in the same conversation as him, was that his company's entire commercial lease, 3 floors of premium office space in downtown Providence, ran through a holding company I'd built from nothing over 31 years. He thought he was talking to a retired handyman. He was, in a way. I'd spent the first 20 years of my working life with tools in my hands. He just didn't know what I'd built with them. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I'm 63 years old. I came to this country from Calabria in southern Italy when I was 19 with $400 and a suitcase that smelled like my mother's kitchen, and I have spent every single day since then building something. First, it was a small renovation crew out of a rented garage in Cranston. Then it was a licensed general contracting firm. Then it was property acquisition, buying distressed commercial buildings, renovating them, leasing them to businesses that needed a home. I never advertised. I never put my name on the side of a van after the first decade. I wore work boots to job sites until I was 52, not because I had to, but because it kept me honest. My son, I'll call him my boy, because that's what he is to me, 34 years old, and still the kid who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from job sites. Met his fiancée about 2 years ago. I liked her immediately. She was sharp and funny, and she looked at my son the way his mother used to look at me before she passed, which is to say, like he was the most interesting person in any room. Her name was Celeste. Her family was from Connecticut. Her father, I'll call him the man, had made his money in commercial real estate development, which, I would later understand, was why he felt entitled to have opinions about everyone else's. The birthday party was for my granddaughter, my daughter's little girl, who was turning 4. We'd done it in my backyard because I have the space. I'd strung lights between the oak trees, set up a little bounce house, made 3 trays of my mother's lasagna from memory. Nothing fancy. It was a family afternoon. Celeste came, which I appreciated. She'd been to the house before, and she was always easy, always offered to help carry things. She brought her parents. That was the first time I met them. Her mother was pleasant. She complimented the lasagna twice, which, honestly, is the correct response to that lasagna. Her father shook my hand and looked around the yard in a way I recognized. The way a man looks at something when he's already decided it doesn't impress him, but he's trying to find the polite words for it. My son introduced us. He mentioned briefly that I was in construction. The man nodded and said something like, "Oh, so you're in the trades?" Not a question. A categorization. I said yes, which was accurate, technically. We drifted into conversation the way you do at a backyard party. He asked where I'd grown up. I told him Italy. He asked what part. I told him Calabria. He repeated the word in a way that telegraphed he didn't know where that was and wasn't particularly interested in finding out. Then his wife drifted away toward my daughter, and it was just the 2 of us standing near the drink table, and he said, "I want to be precise because I've thought about this sentence many times since." He said, "I imagine it must feel good to have gotten this far, given where you started." I looked at him for a moment. "It does," I said. He smiled, the smile of a man who considers himself generous. We didn't talk much after that, but I watched him for the rest of the afternoon, and what I saw was a man who moved through the world with the settled confidence of someone who has never once been surprised by it. He spoke over his wife twice. He corrected my son on a piece of sports trivia with the enthusiasm of someone who needed to be right. When my 4-year-old granddaughter ran up and crashed into his legs, he took 1 step back and patted her on the head without looking down. My son called me that night after everyone had left. He was happy. He said the afternoon had gone well, that Celeste's parents had liked the lasagna. I said that was good. He said, "Her dad wants to have dinner, just the 4 of us, you and him, and then Celeste and me. He wants to talk about the wedding." I said that sounded fine. The dinner was 3 weeks later, at a restaurant the man chose in Newport. The kind of place where the menu doesn't have prices on the version they hand you. I'd been to restaurants like that. I wore what I always wear to a nice dinner: dark trousers, a collared shirt, a blazer I've had for 12 years that still fits because I've kept the same weight since I was 40. My son looked nervous when I got there. Celeste squeezed his hand. We ordered. We talked about the weather, about the drive. Then the man set down his drink and said he wanted to talk about the wedding plans, because there were some things he and his wife had been thinking about, and since I was the other parent involved, he wanted to be direct. I said I appreciated directness. He said they had a venue in mind, a property, and here he used the word estate, in Newport that a colleague of his owned, and it could be made available, but it required a commitment of a certain scale. He talked about guest counts, catering minimums, the cost of flowers, the deposit structure. He laid it out the way a man lays something out when he's already made the decision, and is now informing the other party. Then he said the number. He said the expectation. His word, expectation, was that the groom's family would contribute $120,000 toward the wedding. He said this was in keeping with what they had in mind for the event, and since Celeste was their only daughter, they wanted to do it properly. My son went very still. Celeste looked at her plate. I picked up my water glass and took a drink. Then I said, "Can you walk me through how you arrived at that number?" The man seemed slightly surprised that I'd asked, rather than simply responded. He said it was based on the cost of the venue, the per-head catering, the photographer they had in mind, some other elements. I said, "And what portion of that total are you contributing?" He said they would of course be contributing significantly. He mentioned a number. It was larger than mine, but not by the margin his tone suggested. I said, "So you're asking me to fund roughly 40% of an event I haven't been consulted on, at a venue I wasn't part of choosing." He said he understood that it might feel sudden, but that they'd been planning this for some time and really felt this was the right setting for the occasion. I said, "I'm going to need some time to think about this." He nodded, in the way of a man who expects the thinking to conclude an agreement. In the car afterward, my son called me from his phone while I was still driving. He was apologetic in that way he gets, the way where he takes responsibility for things that aren't his fault. He said he'd had no idea about the number, that Celeste had been embarrassed, that he'd talked to her, that maybe they could find a compromise. I told him not to worry tonight. I told him to go home and get some sleep, and I'd call him in the morning. I drove home and sat in my kitchen for a while. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I think it matters. I wasn't angry, exactly, not yet. What I felt was a kind of clarity, the specific clarity that comes when someone shows you precisely what they think of you. And you realize you have a choice about what to do with that information. The man had looked at me, my accent, my background, my career in the trades, and he had done the math in his head and arrived at a conclusion, that I would either be flattered into agreement, or I'd simply be unable to afford to say no, that either way the outcome would be the same. What he had not done was look me up, which, in the age of the internet, I found almost admirable in its laziness. If he had, he would have found the holding company. He would have found 12 commercial properties in Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts. He would have found the Cranston building and the building on Atwells Avenue, and this is the part I found genuinely funny, sitting in my kitchen at 11 o'clock at night. The building on Thames Street in Newport, 3 floors of Class A office space, where his development firm had been a tenant for 9 years. I didn't do anything dramatic that night. I went to bed. Over the next 2 weeks, I did some quiet checking. Had my attorney pull the lease, reviewed the terms. The man's company was current on rent, no issues there. But the lease was up for renewal in 4 months. Standard commercial terms. They'd already sent a letter of intent to renew. I also made some calls to people I know in the Newport development space, the way you do when you've been doing business somewhere for 3 decades. What I learned was that the man had been having a difficult couple of years. 2 projects that hadn't penciled out the way he'd projected. He'd had to restructure some financing. His firm was solid but not expansive. The Newport office was, by all accounts, central to his operation. Moving would be disruptive, expensive, badly timed. I sat with all of this. Let me be clear about something. I was not plotting revenge. I don't think of myself that way, and I don't want you to think of me that way. What I was doing was understanding the situation fully before I made a decision. That's what 30 years of business teaches you. You don't react. You assess. You act when you understand the whole picture. My son called me twice during those 2 weeks. The second time, he said that Celeste's father had followed up, that the man had asked if I'd had time to think, that there was a deadline on the venue because another family was interested. I told my son to tell him I was still considering. Then I called my son separately and said something to him that I want to get right. I said, "I love you. I love Celeste. I'm not going to let anything I do get in the way of your happiness. But I need you to trust me for a little while, and I need you not to ask me questions I'm not ready to answer yet." He said, "Okay, which is one of the reasons I love my son. He knows when to be quiet. I had my attorney reach out to the man's firm through proper channels. Nothing unusual. It was time to begin the lease renewal conversation. A standard touch base. The attorney mentioned, professionally, that the ownership group was weighing some options for the building, and that they wanted to understand the tenant's plans before making any decisions. 3 days later, I got a call. Not from the man's office. From the man himself. He didn't know he was calling me. He asked for the property manager. My attorney had given him my direct line, with a note that the owner preferred to handle this personally. So there he was on my cell phone, introducing himself, his full name, his company name, his connection to the Thames Street building, and telling me he'd been a tenant for nearly a decade and hoped they could discuss the renewal. I said, "Yes, I know who you are." There was a pause. He said, "I'm sorry, have we spoken before?" I said, "We had dinner about 3 weeks ago in Newport. My son is engaged to your daughter." The pause that followed was one of the longer ones I've experienced in a business conversation. He said, I wasn't aware that you. I said, "No, you weren't." And then I said something I'd been turning over in my head for a few days. I said, "I've been thinking about what you said at dinner, the expectation. And I've been thinking about the word itself, expectation, and what it implies about what you think of me and where I come from. I want you to understand something. I don't need your respect. I built everything I have without it, and I'll continue to do so. But I'm not going to participate in teaching my son that the right response to that kind of assumption is to write a check." He started to speak. I let him say a few words, something about misunderstanding, about not having meant any offense. I said, "I'm going to suggest we handle the wedding differently. The kids should plan what they want, and we should each contribute what we can and want to contribute, without preconditions. If they want the Newport estate, we can figure out how to make that work together, as equals. If that doesn't suit your vision, then maybe the wedding looks different. But I won't be presenting my son with a bill someone else generated." Another pause. Then he said, very quietly, "And the lease?" I said, "That's a separate matter, and it'll be handled through my attorney on its own timeline." He asked, and I'll give him credit for asking directly, whether the two things were related. I said, "The decision about the lease will be based on what makes sense for the building and for my business, not on anything personal. That's how I've always operated, and I'm not going to change that because someone put me in an uncomfortable situation over dinner." I meant that. I want to be clear that I meant it. What I didn't say, and didn't need to say, was that the calculation had already changed, not because I was punishing him, but because a man who spent 9 years in my building without ever knowing my name had never bothered to find out who he was dealing with, and that kind of carelessness tends to compound over time. The lease was not renewed. My attorney handled it professionally and correctly. The man's firm received proper notice, within terms, with sufficient time to find alternative space. It wasn't comfortable for them, and I understood that, and I didn't feel good about their difficulty. What I felt was neutral, businesslike, which is how I try to feel about business. What happened next with the wedding is what I actually care about in this story. My son called me the night after the man and I had our phone conversation. He said Celeste had spoken to him, that her father had told her about the call, that Celeste had then had a very long conversation with her mother, and that conversation had apparently covered a lot of ground, including, my son said carefully, some things about how her father treated people he didn't consider his equals. Celeste called me herself the next evening. She apologized, which I told her she had absolutely nothing to apologize for. She said she'd been embarrassed at the dinner, had felt blindsided, had wanted to say something but didn't know how. I told her the truth, that none of what happened was about her, and that nothing that happened would change how I felt about her coming into our family. She cried a little, so did I, a little, though I didn't tell her that until later. The wedding ended up being nothing like what the man had originally described. They found a venue in Bristol, an old waterfront inn, beautiful in a quiet way, the kind of place where you can hear the water. My son and Celeste chose it together. It held about 90 people. My son's aunt made the floral arrangements because she'd been doing weddings for 20 years, and she was honestly better than anything you'd hire. I made 3 trays of my mother's lasagna for the rehearsal dinner. The man attended. We didn't speak much. He was cordial. I was cordial. He shook my hand at the end of the night, and there was something in his grip that was different from the first time. less the handshake of a man confirming his position, and more the handshake of a man who has recently revised an opinion. I don't know what he told himself about all of it. I suspect he constructed a version where he'd been reasonable throughout, and circumstances had simply clarified things. That's usually how people like that manage it. What I know is what my son said to me at the end of his wedding reception, standing by the water at about 10:30 at night, after most of the dancing was done. He'd had a couple of drinks, and his jacket was off, and he was relaxed in the way I hadn't seen him relaxed in months. He put his arm around my shoulders the way he used to do when he was little, the reverse of the way it goes now, and he said, "I used to wonder, when I was a kid, why you never seemed to care what people thought of you." I said, "What did you decide?" He said, "I think I finally get it. You just always knew what you were." I've thought about that sentence a lot since then. It's the closest thing to a summary of my life I've ever heard. I came here at 19 with $400 in a suitcase. I built something. Not to prove anything to anyone, not to collect a moment where someone finally understood they'd underestimated me, although I'd be lying if I said those moments don't have a particular texture to them. I built it because that's what I knew how to do, because my father built things, and his father before him, and the tools change, but the work doesn't. Celeste is good for my son. She has her father's sharpness without his need to establish himself at other people's expense. She calls me on my birthday and argues with me about soccer, and she learned to make the lasagna from scratch last December, which is the kind of thing that matters in our family in a way that's hard to explain. The man and I are not friends. We probably won't be. But at my granddaughter's last birthday, my son and Celeste's daughter now, born this past spring, named after my late wife, he sat across the table from me and ate 3 helpings of that lasagna, and at one point he looked up and said simply, "This is exceptional." I said thank you, which is, all things considered, exactly the right amount of grace for the situation.